Watercolor paint is referred to as a water media paint. The term water media is simply a term for any paint that is thinned and applied to a painting surface using water. Under this umbrella, there are several paints, including watercolor, fresco, egg tempera, gouache, and even acrylic. Let's take a brief look at each one and see how they compare to watercolor paints. We'll also take a brief look at oil, a paint that is not considered water-soluble. The first of the mediums we'll look at is watercolor. Watercolors use gum arabic as its binder. Now, gum arabic is simply the sap of the acacia tree, which is a tree that's found throughout Africa, specifically the Sudan, and on the Indian subcontinent. There are claims that gum arabic was used as a binder as far back as the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, and Greeks. But it really became popular during the 14th century, when artists discovered that it could be used in thin layers and that it produced more vibrant results than the binder they had been using, which was from eggs. Gum arabic is colorless and slows the absorption of the paint into the surface, allowing the ability to manipulate the flow of the pigment. This is still the binder that we use for watercolors today. One of the benefits of using gum arabic as a binder is that the paint can be reworked when re-wet. It's also water-soluble, meaning the binder dissolves in water rather than just floating around in it. The next paint we'll discuss is fresco. Fresco was a popular painting method used by most of the ancient civilizations. They were still extremely popular during the Renaissance and even into the Baroque period of the 1600s and 1700s. Historically, the paint used was simply ground pigment, mixed with water, and then painted on top of a wet, plastered surface, usually a wall or ceiling. As the plaster dried, the pigment chemically bonded to the plaster and became permanent when completely dry. So basically, the binder for a fresco is the plaster. Now, because the pigment is sealed into the plaster, it's understandable that frescoes are not reworkable once dry. Egg tempera is also very similar to traditional watercolor paint in that it's thinned and applied with water. But the binder used for egg tempera is, as the name implies, egg, specifically egg yolk and, on occasion, egg white. It's been used for many centuries and really had its heyday during the Byzantine era, when it was really the medium of choice for religious paintings. This paint is often made by the artist in the studio, as it has been for many centuries. But because it's made with raw egg, the fresh paint has a limited lifespan, one of the medium's drawbacks. That said, when it's applied properly to a painting surface, the paint is extraordinarily durable and long-lasting. Egg tempera dries even faster than traditional watercolor, making application a little tricky. Paint is built up in multiple, very thin, transparent layers. And although it's dry to the touch within a few minutes, the artwork doesn't fully cure, meaning fully dry, for 6 to 12 months. However, once it's fully dry, it is less vulnerable to heat and humidity than watercolor paint. An important difference between watercolor and egg tempera is the lack of flow. Egg tempera dries too quickly and must be applied too thinly for the paint to truly flow through water. In this example, I'm applying very, very watery paint on a slanted surface, and you can see it's just not traveling very far. It's also not quite as reworkable once it's dry. It does, however, produce nice glazing effects when you layer. And the resulting colors, although they're cooler than traditional watercolors, don't change as the paint dries or over time. Gouache is basically watercolor paint using gum arabic as its binder, but it has larger pigment particles and the addition of either white paint or a type of chalk. The larger particles and addition of white means the paint is much more opaque or not transparent. In fact, in addition to being opaque, the paint layer is thicker than conventional watercolor, which means the brightness of the color comes from the paint layer itself, not from the white of the paper beneath, as is seen in conventional watercolor. But like its sister paint, gouache is reworkable once dry. Since these paints are such a close relative of traditional watercolor, they can easily be included in the artist's palette. And if used carefully, it can be a useful tool for correcting errors. Acrylic paint is one of the youngest of the painting mediums. It was developed around the 1940s and really came into popularity around the 1960s with artists like Andy Warhol or abstract expressionist Mark Rothko. Acrylic paint uses an acrylic polymer as its binder. Acrylic polymer is basically a type of plastic, which, when you think about that, it makes it more understandable that you cannot rework acrylic paint that's already dried. Like egg tempera, acrylics dry very quickly. In fact, so quickly that it's difficult to get smooth blends over large areas. The paint is non-toxic and allows the artist to paint either very thin or very thick layers of paint. Although the colors produced are quite bright, there is a degree of color change that happens as the paint dries. Oil paints were developed and became popular around the Renaissance, which would be the 14 and 1500s. Which is surprising because I think people sometimes feel that it is the oldest medium, but really, egg tempera, fresco, other variants of watercolor predate it by thousands of years. Oil paints are in a category all their own. Although they use the same pigments as other paints, the binder, which is a type of oil, such as linseed or walnut, is not water-soluble, meaning oil doesn't dissolve in water. And so the artist needs to use what's called a solvent to thin the paint. A solvent is simply a substance that can dissolve another substance. These solvents, such as turpentine or Gamsol, must be handled carefully because direct, extended exposure isn't very good for your health. A benefit of using oil as a binder, though, is that the paints are luscious, saturated, and very durable. The negative? Well, there is a long drying time, 1 to 3 days between coats of paint, 6 to 12 months for it to fully cure. Also, oil paint is not reworkable once dry, and even though you can get transparent glazes, it's not transparent in quite the same way that watercolors are. Now, there are water mixable oil paints on the market today. These paints use an additive that separates the oil into tiny, tiny droplets, which can then mix with water. But it's still going to function like an oil paint. It won't function like watercolor because it still consists of oil. It's just that now you can mix your brushes and thin the paint with water. We actually haven't touched on all the paint mediums. You still have pastel, in which the pigments are mixed with a binder, but the objective isn't to have a liquid form, it's rather to hold the pigment into the form of a stick. And then you have encaustic, which has been around almost as long as watercolor itself, but that works with beeswax. However, the ones we're covering are the ones that are more closely related to watercolor. In the next 3 videos, we'll have a hands-on demonstration of the lifting capabilities and the flow of water media paints.